who sold provisions to folks. So it was, it's a full-on weekend of Confederate reenactment. On the inside of the Jefferson Davis Library and Museum, there are displays about Davis, about the Civil War, various things. And they're a very particular kind of historical interpretation. You have to look very, very hard to find anything about slavery, the African American experience, the enslavement of African Americans. There's a little panel by the Elevators that talks about a couple of formerly enslaved people who actually came back to the Davises after the end of slavery, which is very interesting. Those are true stories, and yet what they leave out is there's a tremendous sin of omission. They don't, for example, talk about the huge number of enslaved people who escaped from Jefferson Davis's plantation. So that really caught my eye, along with all of these black children learning this Confederate mythology.
Well, what was the view presented of the issues the war was fought over?
So, states' rights is at the top. They never mention what the rights they were fighting for were, which is the right, generally speaking, to own other people. They talk about fighting for their heritage, their homeland, fighting against northern aggression, all of those various things. And you can't tell an honest story about the Civil War and the period before the Civil War and Reconstruction without including African American testimony and particular facts in your story. So the idea that we only get the perspective of the so-called loyal slaves. When I was there in between the musters, I saw some panels about black Confederates. Now, this is something that's been disputed and debated hotly, but all of the scholarship is on the side of there were no regiments, there was no substantial fighting force of black Confederates. Now, we can look on the United States side, and we've got about 187,000 soldiers, including my great-grandfather. So that's what we're not hearing. So we're kind of circulating through this space and hearing these stories about what the power brokers were doing. The power brokers were clearly fighting to preserve the right to enslave other people.
50 years, when the South was segregated, you probably wouldn't have seen black people visiting such a site. You did. I'm wondering if you observed interactions between either black school kids or adults and, the guides and reenactors, and whether there were interesting exchanges.
When my partner, Seth Freed Weskler, talked to an African-American mother, she was aghast at what her daughter, her African-American daughter, was being told. She was being told this incomplete and this rather romantic picture of what the South was like under slavery. Her mother told her that she would have been property of Jefferson Davis. So this talk about, Jefferson Davis being benevolent and so on and so forth, the people he owned were property, just like any other slave owner.
So who runs Beauvoir, this Jefferson Davis home, and how are its operations funded?
Beauvoir is run by the Mississippi Sons of Confederate Veterans, which is a chapter of the National Confederate Heritage Group. It's funded by donations by members, and then there's the $100,000 it gets every year from the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. That money is earmarked for preservation of the historic aspects of Beauvoir. So that's the cottages that were built in the 1850s by the Brown family and that Jefferson Davis and his family lived in. So that $100,000 is supposed to go to that. But what we found, what Seth and I found in our work, was that there were tens of millions of dollars that went into the newer stuff at Beauvoir, including that $8 million library, and that was federal money. So Hurricane Katrina destroyed much of what was at Beauvoir, including their library museum. rather than rebuild or renovate, they built an entirely new facility. So a huge amount of money has gone to Beauvoir in the past, since around 2005, 2006. We were curious about the messages that were being subsidized by tax dollars. And what we found, again, was something that was not history. It was closer to ideology.
You write about efforts made to preserve and care for the graves of Confederate soldiers, and that in Virginia, a lot of that money was routed through the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Tell us a little bit about that group.
Every single person's ancestor deserves to be memorialized and deserves to have his or her final resting place taken care of. What we were looking into was the differential, the disparate funding for Confederate graves and cemeteries, and the complete lack of funding for historic African American cemeteries. So that's how I came to this story. I was actually working and doing documentation on restoring black cemeteries, and just down the street there was a Oakwood Cemetery. It's got a Confederate section. It's beautiful, it's pristine, it's well maintained. Well, the city has a special deal with the Sons of Confederate Veterans. They have a special right of entry agreement, and every year the Sons of Confederate Veterans get a certain amount of money to maintain graves there. That money, as you said, Dave, is channeled through the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which is one of the main purveyors of this lost cause narrative. That money has been dispensed by the General Assembly since 1902. That's a pretty heavy-duty investment in one people's set of ancestors, when cemeteries like East End and Evergreen and hundreds of similar cemeteries across the South, black cemeteries, have been